Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. I am Nata Devori, Associate Professor and Head of Discipline of Gender and Women's Studies in the School of Political Science and Sociology. It is my pleasure to welcome everyone to this virtual book launch of a very timely and important book, Combating Disability and Harassment at Work, Human Rights in Practice, by Lucy-Anne Buckley, Associate Professor of Law at the University of Galway. The research in this book is extremely critical to the current debates on advancing the SDGs, and in particular, addressing the Goal 5 on gender equality, which is a specific target on the elimination of violence and harassment against all women and girls. An intersectional perspective clearly suggests the importance of addressing violence and harassment experienced by women and girls with disabilities specifically. A crucial question, of course, is what is effective in addressing intersectional violence and harassment, and in particular, what is the role of the law? Professor Buckley's research is a brilliant exercise in establishing, through a rich and critical analysis of legal cases, to distill the key barriers limiting effective legal solutions. And I think this will be a very important discussion to have. Today, Professor Buckley will first provide an overview of her research and its implications for addressing the SDGs, followed by comments from her distinguished colleague, Dr. Shreya Atre. We will then have time for discussion. So please do ensure to put your questions in the Q&A function down in bar below, and we will address these after both have spoken. So a few words of introduction for our speakers. As I said, Dr. Lucy-Anne Buckley is Associate Professor in Law. She specializes in employment equality law, particularly in relation to gender, disability, and intersectional issues. From 2018 to 2020, Lucy acted as an expert advisor to the states of Guernsey, or the Channel Islands, in relation to the development of a new multi-ground equality legislation. She previously contributed to the joint statement towards inclusive social protection systems, supporting the full and effective participation of persons with disabilities in 2019. This is a protocol that was developed by the International Labour Organization in consultation with stakeholder organizations. She has published widely regarding equality issues, with recent publications addressing reasonable accommodation for persons with disabilities, sexual harassment of women with disabilities, and gender equality in Irish employment law. Her book, Combating Disability and Harassment at Work, Human Rights in Practice, was published by Bristol University Press in September 2022. The discussant in today's event is Dr. Shreya Atre, who is an associate professor in international human rights law based at the Bonavero Institute of Human Rights at University of Oxford. She is an editor for Human Rights Law Review and official fellow of Kellogg College. Her research is on discrimination law, feminist theory, poverty, and disability law. Her monograph, Intersectional Discrimination, which was brought out by OUP in 2019, won the runners-up Peter Burke's Book Prize in 2020 and presents an account of intersectionality theory in comparative discrimination law. Her work has been cited by the South African Constitutional Court and the Supreme Court of India. Shreya is currently working on a project on equality in times in crisis, funded by the British Academy. Previously, Shreya was based at the University of Bristol Law School as a lecturer in law. She also is a Max Weber Fellow at the European University Institute in Florence and a Hauser Postdoctoral Global Fellow at the NYU School of Law in New York. With these few words, I now turn it to Lucy to give an overview of her research and discuss the implications of her findings for advancing the SDGs. Lucy?
Thanks, Nata. That was a very kind introduction. I'm delighted to be speaking about the book today and looking at the issue of combating disability harassment at work. And as Nata mentioned, this is, and of course I can get the slides to work. Here we are. I suppose really just I wanted to kind of start out by giving a bit of context about what this research is about and why I think it is important for the achievement of the SDGs in particular. So for those people who might not be as familiar with the idea of disability harassment, we're talking here about behavior that is intimidating, hostile, humiliating, demeaning, insulting, that is related to someone's disability and of course then which is unwelcome to the victim and creates a hostile environment for them. Now that hostile environment could be in a work context, which is the focus of the particular book that I have written, but of course it could also arise in many other contexts such as education or sport or street harassment, etc. And the reason why I think this is such an important issue for us to look at is, first of all, because we have a weight of international evidence that suggests that this is a really widespread problem, a really, really prevalent issue for persons with disabilities. So, for example, we've evidence that persons with disabilities are disproportionately subject to bullying and harassment in the work context and also the non-work context. So, for example, there's evidence from the UK that persons with disabilities or a long-term illness were over twice as likely to report bullying or harassment in the employment context. And there's evidence from the US, an important research paper there from Shaw et al., which examined all the EEOC cases and that found that after gender, disability was the most important factor in predicting harassment allegations, followed then by age and race. And we have evidence similarly from Canada and Australia and other contexts, and in Ireland as well too. It's not something we have studied hugely here, but we do have data, from example, from the CSO in 2019 that around 12% of respondents in their particular piece of work reported work-related discrimination. This is respondents, with disabilities. And again, bullying and harassment were the most common complaints in that context. The second reason I think disability harassment is really important, and you pointed to it there, Nata, in your introduction, is the whole issue of intersectionality. And as I mentioned a moment ago, there's evidence that, from that study by Shaw et al., that persons with disabilities are also disproportionately subject to intersectional forms of harassment. Here, for example, we will be talking about combinations of disability and gender, disability and race, disability and sexual orientation, among other factors. And we also have very strong evidence internationally that women with disabilities in particular are particularly subject to and affected by sexual harassment and forms of gender-based violence, both inside of the workplace and outside of it. So this could be not just, for example, in employment, but also in education, in care facilities, in relationships, and so on. So for all of those reasons, it's a really important intersectional issue as well. And then the third reason I'm just identifying here, and of course, obviously I could identify others, but in terms of achieving sustainable development goals, Nata, you mentioned SDG 5, and absolutely this is something that is really important in the context of achieving gender equality and ensuring gender equality for all women and girls, not just particular cohorts of women and girls. So women and girls with disabilities are particularly affected, as I said, by sexual harassment and other forms of harassment. But it's also important in the context of SDG 8, which is about achieving decent work for people. And so we want to achieve full and productive employment and decent work for women and men, and for all persons, including persons with disabilities. And that means we have to protect labour rights, and we have to create a safe working environment for those people. And again, this is really important in the context of disability because, again, we have evidence that persons with disabilities are less able to participate in the labour market. They're more excluded from it in practice. They are more at risk of poverty, for example, and particularly women with disabilities in that regard. So, access to decent work and decent working conditions is really, really important for achieving the SDGs. And then SDG 10, of course, refers to reduced inequalities. So we're talking here about increasing the economic, social and political inclusion of everyone, irrespective of characteristics such as disability, and then introducing and ensuring we have equal opportunities for everyone through the introduction of appropriate legislation and other policy measures. So when it comes to actually implementing that, and achieving those particular SDGs and those goals, it's really important, I think, first of all, to look at the human rights framework here. And when we do look at the human rights framework, I would highlight particularly, of course, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And also in the European EU context, we have the Framework Employment Directive. And then most recently, we have the ILO Violence and Harassment Convention, C190, which just came into effect last year. And all of those highlight the importance of disability equality, obviously, but would also all address specifically, and also, for example, in instruments such as the general comments on by the committee on the rights of persons with disabilities. They all highlight the importance of addressing disability harassment, and they discuss in detail what that actually involves. I suppose the most interesting feature perhaps that I would highlight here is that whereas we have traditionally highlighted disability harassment as an equality issue, most recently, and of course it is an equality issue, absolutely, but most recently we also have a move in the ILO Convention to highlighting freedom from violence and harassment at work as a human right that should apply to everyone, as well as the equality aspect of that. And both the CRPD and the ILO Convention also very much highlight the issue of intersectionality as something that has to be addressed. Now, the problem is that when we come to implementing this framework in practice, of course, normally we're relying on states to introduce legislation that will address disability harassment. But straight away, the problems start arising. So, for example, a recent study of all the UN countries showed that, in fact, only about 30% of them have disability harassment legislation specifically. And in fact, the rate of legislation is lower when we're talking about lower income countries. I think it's something like 16%, I think, actually, in terms of lower income countries that actually have that kind of legislation, compared with, I think, 58% of higher income countries. So there's straight away a disparity here. And then when we look at, okay, you have your legislation, hooray, it's great. And you look at how it's working in practice. Again, there's not vast amounts of evidence on this, which is why I actually undertook this book. But insofar as we have evidence, that evidence suggests that national laws are not particularly effective in practice in combating disability harassment. And there would be various reasons for that. One of them is chronic underreporting. And this is very pervasive problem across the whole area of equality law, so that most people who experience discrimination are not ever going to either report it formally, maybe in their workplace, but they're also even less likely to bring a legal complaint. So we have this whole issue of lack of reporting, and a lot of that centers around barriers to reporting, which has many reasons behind it. For example, you could be fear of retaliation. If I complain, what will happen to me? And even where you have provisions addressing that, people might not necessarily be persuaded or feel confident to bring their complaints forward. But particularly, people don't have resources, they don't have time, they don't have energy. Particularly, you might face barriers about feeling that you will not be believed, or that somehow you were at fault because this happened, or this behavior is just so normalized, that no one is going to believe you or accept what you're saying. And then we have whole issues of accessibility, particularly in the disability context, but also in other contexts, for example, in the context of race, or particularly migrant workers who might not speak the language and that might not understand the provisions that are there that they could actually avail of. And then when you do bring a complaint, suppose you do bring one, the evidence suggests that there isn't a huge rate of success for equality complaints generally. So, for example, one of the few studies on this was by Weber in the United States in 2007, and he found that the vast majority of disability harassment cases that were taken under the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, they were actually unsuccessful. And we have evidence generally that equality cases are not particularly successful in practice. There's most recently, for example, evidence from Australia, a detailed study by Alicia Blackham, where she found that age discrimination cases are just horrifically unsuccessful as well. So there's this whole issue of you finally make your complaint and then you find you don't really have much chance of success. And compounding all of these issues, then we have this whole other issue of states failing to monitor what is actually happening. It sort of seems to be assumed, well, we've got the legislation in place, great, that's the end of it. And nobody really is tracking what is happening in practice. And this is despite the emphasis placed in the CRPD especially, but also in the ILO Convention, on the importance of gathering disaggregated data. So it's not just even how many harassment cases succeed in general, but specifically how many disability harassment cases are brought and how many of those actually succeed. So those are some of the issues that we might come across in practice. And I am trying to keep this fairly brief and condense a lot of information. But this book then looked at disability harassment claims in Ireland specifically. Now, Ireland's a really interesting case study because we are signatories to the CRPD. We've ratified it since 2018. We are also, of course, bound by EU law. We have very specific and detailed harassment provisions in place under the Employment Equality Act, 98 to 2021. But nobody has ever really checked, well, what is actually happening in practice. So I actually identified all the cases where disability harassment claims had gone to hearing since the inception of the legislation up to February 2020. And my guess had been that there would not be that many cases, simply because, as I say, chronic underreporting is such an issue. And in fact, there were very few successful cases, only 100 cases at all, only 110 cases actually went to hearing in that time. To put that in context, we're talking about a labour market that has over 176,000 persons with disabilities who are active in the labour market. We also have evidence that disability harassment generally and negative attitudes towards persons with disabilities, that these are big problems, and yet only 110 cases going to hearing. Now, of course, there can be a lot of reasons behind that. Cases might settle, for example, or be mediated, or there could be other ways where cases conclude, but still very few actually going to hearing in over 22 years. And then when those cases did go to hearing, this was the really shocking bit to me, because when we look at the data we do have about success rates in equality actions in Ireland, we'd normally be talking about a quarter to a third would be upheld. So my assumption had been that we would roughly be talking about a quarter to a third of disability harassment claims being upheld. In fact, only 5 were. Okay, so 5 cases in 22 years where a disability harassment complaint was actually upheld. It's less than 5%. Now, those people might well have succeeded under other complaint headings. I mean, I'm just looking at the outcome of disability harassment cases specifically, but still, this is a really shockingly low figure. And I guess what this raised to me was the whole issue of how can we make disability harassment law more effective? What is it that we need to do? Because I'm not saying for a moment that we shouldn't have disability harassment law, that we don't need it. Yes, it's really important to set standards, and of course it will provide an outcome for some people, and of course it will guide policy development in the workplace in terms of framing policies about acceptable behaviour. But it does seem to boil down to very much a picture of this is not enough. Okay, this is not achieving a successful outcome for most complainants. It's not really being successful in combating disability harassment more generally. So what can we do? And given, as I said at the outset, that this is a hugely prevalent problem and has such implications for women with disabilities in particular, and is so important for achieving the SDGs, how can we make it more effective? So one of the things I argue in the book is that we need to shift towards a more proactive employer duty in particular, that employers need to be doing more to combat disability harassment at source, and not just, it shouldn't just be a complaint-led model, because people just don't make complaints and they don't succeed in enough complaints to make that an effective strategy for combating disability harassment. So I'm not going to say a huge amount about that now, but we might discuss it later in the discussion after Shreya has spoken. Just for anyone who's interested, that is the book, and I would just point out that the ebook is very affordable and is significantly probably better value than the hardback, but it's available from Bristol University Press, and for anyone who is interested, and I hope you would find it an interesting read. So thanks very much, and I will hand back to Nata now, or to Shreya.
Thank you, Lucy. That was an excellent presentation and really gives us a sweep overview of the content of the book and the main arguments and important arguments that need to be discussed further. And I'm sure, Shreya, you would be having some insightful comments on Lucy's argument. So over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nata, for the kind introduction earlier, and thank you, Lucy, for an excellent overview of your work in the book. And thank you all for being here today. Harassment as a topic is usually studied, especially in equality and discrimination law, with the signifier sexual or sometimes racial. There's something about harassment as a general form of discrimination which evades inquiry, especially in contexts beyond sexual harassment, because the definition of harassment as sexual harassment, which is about unwanted or unwelcome behavior, which is sexual in nature, almost prevents us from thinking about unwanted or unwelcome behavior of any other kind. In fact, the trend in equality and discrimination law has been to understand the meaning of discrimination via other concepts. They could be values and concepts such as dignity, autonomy, capabilities, relegating this idea of types or forms of discrimination such as stereotyping, prejudice, or harassment very much to the status of secondary relevance. So to produce a general treatment of harassment in equality and discrimination law via the lens of disability is not just useful for its own sake, but quite important in the larger state of affairs of the field that I've described to you, the field of equality and discrimination law. Which is why I took great interest in and eventually thoroughly enjoyed Lucy's Combating Disability Harassment at Work. The key interest for me really was to better understand disability harassment as a conceptual category, especially how it differs from what we know of harassment more broadly. And this is a useful question to ask because norms in the field of disability harassment are sparse. They're not many, and those there are, especially in international law under the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, are not as fully fleshed out. Well, they're international norms, so to say. So Lucy's book contributes to making most of the norms there are and reflecting not only on their legal applicability and effectiveness, which I'll come to in a moment, but more importantly, their conceptual meaning. And here is what stood out to me in that inquiry into conceptual meaning. That Lucy's view of disability harassment is not monocausal, and that she's tried to create a worldview of harassment which reflects the routine and everyday practices of, say, intimidation or bullying against persons with disabilities, as occurring as often a result of multiple and intersecting identity grounds. And intersectionality thus seems to be key to Lucy's conceptualization of disability harassment from the word go. It is not an add-on where disability harassment is first defined as a standalone form of disadvantage and different forms of other disadvantage then interact with disability. It is what it is, because disabilities, and very many of disabilities, they interact with identity grounds such that what is disability harassment is co-constituted. I think that's really key to Lucy's account, which is, I think, special and not often seen in the way people define what things are conceptually. The definitions themselves are never intersectional in nature. And I think it's a good step in the field, which is really devoid of this thinking and really works with monocausal field. Monocausal thinking. I think it's in fact, it cannot be stated enough that this is how redefinitions should be taking place. So I think this is an important step for the field of equality and discrimination law to have this kind of reconstitution which Lucy has offered to us. I think this then feeds into my second learning from the conceptual account which is presented in the book, which is about the use of international law and municipal or corporate law or comparative law. So I think the simultaneous engagement with international norms on the one hand and domestic contexts such as Ireland on the other, but also with references repeat from the UK and Australia, it really lends itself to the field of what is called now the comparative international law, which is really at the cutting edge of both international law scholarship and comparative scholarship. And I think the difficulty with this work often lies with the disjuncture between the vocabularies or the syntaxes of different fields, where international law, especially international human rights law, is often considered too much of an outlier to even be law, and much of municipal or domestic law is considered the real stuff of significance. Lucy's work doesn't simply flip this relationship. It does not abandon the logic of international law and the relevance of instruments like CRPD, but as mediated by this idea of state sovereignty, which is the governing principle in international law. But I think Lucy's work integrates CRPD with the municipal law by using it almost as an interpretive tool in advancing domestic law. And it shows that the norms at these multiple levels are often not congruent and in fact even diverge. But it's the seamlessness of the analysis Lucy is offering at the international level and then at the domestic level, which is sort of feeding into another and really reflecting on the norms and their meaning, scope, and eventually their effectiveness, which I think is quite remarkable. I think some of the most revealing aspects of this analysis are really located in the discussion on Irish law, which I personally found most illuminating as a reader who does not often work with Irish law. But add to this actually another layer of the European Union law, and the legal analysis that is offered in the book stands out, not only then for its breadth, but its eventual contribution, which shows us that the cross-section of norms across international, regional, and domestic law do not always yield the best form of protection, because it is ultimately the effectiveness of these norms that matters in actually improving the lives of persons with disabilities. This central conclusion about effectiveness, I think, is significant. And it is at the forefront of challenges that equality lawyers are facing today. That despite the sophistication of legal norms, equality itself has not advanced. And in fact, inequality and discrimination only seem to be burgeoning, proliferating, and exponentially so. And Lucy's incisive use of statistics, especially those relating to litigation, show just how the small number of cases are actually litigated and even smaller succeed. And as Lucy said, it really complements Elisa Blackham's research in Australia. And I think that movement of studying the effectiveness of norms several decades after the field of equality and discrimination law has become quite the thing. It's quite a technical field. I think it's useful to return to why that technicality is even there. Is it helpful? Is it useful? Is it doing the job that it's hoped that it would do? So I think this more interrogative and investigative approach towards what we believe we are studying, and to see whether it's really making a dent in inequalities and discrimination is really significant in this work. It wouldn't be if, say, litigation was one amongst several ways in which disability harassment law was being enforced. So if litigation was one amongst the many tools international lawyers were bothered with, then perhaps it would have been all right, but that's not the case. There's no other thing almost other than litigation, other than in small ways, the public sector equality duty or the human rights duty that exists in some jurisdictions, including in Ireland. But equality lawyers have put literally all eggs in the basket of the claimant-led, complaint-led, court-determined adversarial model of litigation of rights, which is failing to yield progressive results. And I think that is where the discussion of international law, especially sustainable development goals, comes in. That in fact, all international law destabilizes the hegemony of domestic or municipal law, especially the idea of enforceability via courts as the touchstone of determining whether something is even law. Because enforcement in international human rights law is not court-led, but is believed to be enforceable law nonetheless, such as through the monitoring and enforcement mechanisms of treaty bodies, it really pushes us to go beyond the orthodoxy at the practical level in municipal equality and discrimination law, which is all centered around courts. But more importantly, so there's one breaking of orthodoxy at the practical level, but when you focus on international law and broadly sustainable development goals, you also do something normatively. And at the normative level, I think international law and its growing acceptance of what is even considered soft law norms in soft law sources compel us to take sustainable development goals seriously, not because they have the backing of state sovereignty and consent as expressed, say, in treaty law or customary international law, but because they may yet have normative force. So take, for example, Goal 10, which Lucy mentioned, which requires states to reduce inequalities between and within countries. That goal is agnostic to the measures one adopts to achieving that goal. It is not prescriptive on how we get there, what tools we employ, but simply it's a mandate of results. it gives us some space to move away from the curative, ex post, individualized model of enforcement at courts, which yields perhaps a more structural results of kind. And let me explain this. So the obligation of results is one which can have us think about root causes. Say in the context of disability harassment at work, reducing such harassment does not require, or does not only require, stopgap mechanisms that are in the form of reduction of some harassment, but really results which are sustainable, those which last and are not momentary. And that change, or those results, have to be tackling the root causes which produce and reproduce such harassment. That is what we call the transformative approach to equality, that is emblematic of much of international human rights law, such as incorporated in Article 5 of the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, as well as the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. But my point is that transformative approach to equality, which is simply put, is about overturning the patterns of disadvantage and replacing them with sustainable and more equal social, political, cultural, and economic relationships, surely must underlie SDGs too, because obligations of results, in order to be sustainable in the long term, must transform from below. Thinking about root causes of disability harassment at work in structural terms would be key here. So you'd be asking, and you'd be interested in interrogating, say, why modes of production and labor are constructed keeping persons with disabilities outside of that framework, and why persons with disabilities are seen as unfit for the world of work within that framework, which is built to exclude them from the very beginning. And you're probably paying less attention, or you'd be less concerned with interpersonal ideas such as prejudice, such as open hostility towards or aversion to disabilities, to do with disabilities which are seen as taking away from the humanity of persons, making them seem lesser or inferior in the minds of non-disabled people. That is all stuff of importance, but that is all stuff equality and discrimination law has already been bothered with. Instead, I think an obligation of results, I think, compels us to do more structural work, which is, I think, possible within the SDGs, especially Goal 10, in the context of especially in contrast with municipal and domestic law, which has failed to do that structural work in the context of binding hard law so far. I want to end by commending Lucy for the clarity and simplicity with the way in which the book is written. It makes the book really accessible and rich in appreciating the substantive work which has gone in there. But it is one of those books which has already actually done the work and does not leave the reader to do the work deciphering what is going on. In a publishing industry and research environment where books are becoming less of a thing, I think this book delivers more than just the cutting edge work on disability harassment at work, which is its principal inquiry, but really shows us something about where the field of equality and discrimination law as a whole is at. And I think that message is both worrying, but it should also spur us to action. So thank you, Lucy, for the message and for spurring us to action, I hope. Nata, back to you.
Oh, thank you. Shrey, that was a very interesting and incisive comment on Lucy's book. I think there are many questions from your comments as well as from Lucy's presentation. I would again remind everyone that please use the Q&A function to put your questions. There is one question that has been put in the Q&A, and so I think we'll begin with that, and then I will add one or two of my own questions, okay? Is that all right, Lucy and Shreya? So Kate Kenny has written, thanks Lucy Ann. Do we know how many of these disability harassment cases that reach the courts are mixed, i.e. combining gender-based and other claims? From protected disclosure cases, mixed cases have less success compared to single claim cases.
Yes, and that is absolutely spot on, Kate, and thanks for the question. This was something I was really interested in when I was looking at the Irish data, because, okay, all the evidence that we have suggests, as Shreya said, that, you know, the intersections are what is crucial here, not just the disability, important though that is, but that, you know, that we would expect to see a much greater prevalence of cases involving, at the very least, multiple forms of discrimination. Now, we have a complication in the Irish context in that we can't actually deal with intersectional cases under the Employment Equality Act, but you can bring claims on multiple parallel grounds or of different kinds of discrimination. So, for example, you can't argue that the same event is related to both gender and disability. It's got to be one or the other, so it can't be truly intersectional, but you could have claims of disability harassment plus, say, sexual harassment plus, say, racial harassment or something of that kind. Or indeed, you might have claims of disability harassment in conjunction with other forms of discrimination, such as, you know, you were discriminated against in some other way because of your race, or you were denied a promotion or something of that kind, or you were victimized, or you were whatever it was. When we actually looked at the data on the Irish cases, and this was a bit of a crude measure, and I go into this in the methodology in the book, but basically we are talking about an awful lot of cases where, yes, we did identify multiple grounds of claim in the particular case, not necessarily multiple forms of harassment, but discrimination based on multiple different grounds, most commonly gender and race. And you know, there could be different reasons for that. You know, it's a lot easier to drop a ground than it is to add one later, for example. So you might be tempted to tick all the boxes at the outset and just cover all your bases, but not everybody did that, obviously. So there are a lot of cases where people do allege multiple grounds of discrimination, but when you look at who is succeeding, and it's hard to generalize from this because only 5 people succeeded. Only one of those who succeeded had alleged more than one ground of discrimination. So you are, and this accords with the other evidence that we have internationally, that if you allege multiple grounds of discrimination, tribunals seem much less receptive to those claims. We've evidence from the UK on this, we've evidence from Australia on this, we've evidence elsewhere as well. So whether it is simply that they think that they don't believe you, or whether they just don't understand multiple and intersectional discrimination and how it operates, I don't actually know. There need to be a whole piece of work done on that. But the evidence does show that, yes, you are much, much less likely to succeed. And this brings us to another problem, because then, you know, if you were advising a client, the advice you would have to give is just stick to one ground. Because if you plead more than one ground, you're much less likely to succeed. And therefore, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if you're just going to put in one ground, straight away you're hiding this whole other evidence of multiple and intersectional discrimination, and it becomes invisible, and therefore there's no incentive to deal with it, and therefore courts aren't used to it, and therefore they don't respond positively to it. So it really does become a self-fulfilling prophecy, I think. So long story short, yes, you're absolutely right. Multiple discrimination cases were much less likely to succeed.
Shreya, would you like to add anything to that?
What could I say on intersectionality having not taken off? I was really interested to hear Lucy's answer on it, and compare it with the rich methodology Lucy has described. The only thing to say perhaps is what Lucy is saying. I think the significance of it is that it's just replicated across contexts and comparative law, that intersectional grounds of discrimination really don't make up claims of discrimination at all. If you have to advise a client, and if you're a good lawyer, you might as well just have them say, well, just choose a ground. So you don't see those cases appear from the very beginning. And the part of the answer is in the legislative language, the statutory language in the case of Ireland, and also in the case of the UK. The Equality Act 2010 has a provision on combination discrimination, which says you can bring a claim based on more than one ground. So basically 2 grounds, choosing from the list that is provided. That has never been brought into force because the Tory government thinks that it's just not viable enough in terms of the money that is spent on this litigation. So there's no money in the coffers for the state to support such a litigation. And it's interesting to see the kind of reasons that go behind it. Is it just strategic litigation issues that this claim will fail, or is it a bad sort of legislation which doesn't have a provision? Is it about the legislation has something but the government has no will? There's just so many reasons as to why you wouldn't see intersectional cases ever being brought up. Forget about even whether they succeed. And I think those reasons are what makes it useful to continue to ask this question.
And I suppose there's one other thing to add to that, and I think it was a suggestion actually from Alicia Blackham, and that, of course, and it's true that if you're talking about these intersections, you're talking about increasing disadvantage and marginalization. So, you know, however hard it is for people to bring a case to begin with, it's going to be even harder if you are more marginalized and more disadvantaged. So again, that's another reason why those intersectional cases don't tend to make it to the courts, I think.
So let's shift the conversation a little bit, because there's a very interesting question from Janos, saying that essentially you paint a bleak picture about how useful equality law is in combating harassment. What is the alternative? Should we improve or abandon equality law? You mentioned at the beginning of this discussion the relevance of the SDGs, and Shreya has also talked about the SDGs. So is it a development framework not focused on individual litigation, perhaps a more useful framework for combating harassment? Should we abandon equality law for a framework of in favor of development, or enrich equality law with insights from development approach? So do you see the development framework as being relevant for this topic at all? And I just want to add to that, because I think as a development practitioner, I have my own doubts about how relevant the SDGs framework is and what actually have countries committed to. Because when you have a results framework, then you're driven by achieving those results in multiple ways. And it may not be that you're actually addressing structural factors. So
yeah, this is something I struggled with, you know, thinking about, okay, is there a point to this? Keeping equality law, in other words. And yes, I think there is. I don't propose abandoning it, but I do propose supplementing it. And that equality law, in other words, cannot be the sole strategy. And I think Shreya, you used a very nice phrase there when you were talking about not having all your eggs in one basket. And I think that is exactly it. I think equality law can do a certain amount for us. I think it's really important because it sets standards as to what is acceptable behavior, for example, in this context. And it says that, you know, certain things should not be allowed and they are bad and they should be sanctioned, etc., etc. I think they do give a remedy to some people. Of course, we also don't know what effect equality law has had in terms of the development of soft practices in organizations, for example. So organizational culture may be to some extent shaped by policies which are driven by the need to comply with equality legislation. But I think the evidence is pretty clear that an equality law that relies on individual enforcement cannot be the sole strategy. It is not effective. It is not achieving what we need it to achieve. There's two things then about where you might go from there. One, I really like the approach in the ILO Convention on Violence and Harassment, which very much emphasizes a multi-pronged approach that, you know, it's not, yes, you have your equality law, but you might also have, for example, health and safety law, you might have criminal law, you have a whole array of measures coming from different directions that different people might feel able to avail of. And one of the important things about health and safety law in particular is that it is something that requires proactive thought and action. And this goes to the whole idea of addressing the root causes, which you have mentioned there, Shreya and Nata also. This is a social phenomenon that I don't know that you can ever address the root causes solely in an organizational or work-related context. I mean, the foundations are laid long before people actually get to the workplace. But that said, I do think that businesses and employers and organizations can do an awful lot more in that sphere. And one of the things I advocate in the book is that employers should have a positive duty to try and prevent harassment, which could involve, for example, education and so on of workers and awareness raising and so on. One of the problems at the moment is that employers, legally speaking, don't have any duties at all under equality law in terms of preventing harassment. The only way it will arise is if somebody brings a legal claim, then the employer has a defense if they can show they took steps to prevent harassment from occurring. But there is no positive obligation on them to prevent harassment from occurring. It's simply a carrot. Look, you should have your policy here and it'll give you a nice defense, sort of thing. So there has to be some kind of shift from expecting individual enforcement with all the barriers that individuals face, which I go through in the book, to making, to placing somewhat of the burden on the organizations, and this is particularly, I suppose, large-scale organizations and state bodies and public bodies that have the capacity to deal with this. Now, in terms of the SDGs and the development framework, the issue always, of course, is that if it's achieving a result and there's no specifics about how the result is to be achieved, and how much you wonder, this is an issue perennially too, of how much monitoring is even in place to say that people are doing anything or that what they are doing is effective. So I don't think that that development, I think absolutely that this, what is happening in the development context can and should inform what we are doing, but without adequate monitoring and data gathering, it's meaningless. There has to be somebody somewhere who's checking what is actually happening here. Do we have a problem? Have things improved? When did they improve? Why did they improve? And without this kind of data, we will never even know how big a problem it is. And as I say, like in the Irish context, we never bothered checking since 1998, was our legislation actually working? And then I go and check and actually big question mark about this. So Shreya, I don't know if you have thoughts on that particular question.
No, but there are other questions. I wonder if Nata would like to ask one or two of them to you.
Sorry, Nata, you're muted there.
Forget that all the time. There is a question here that, Lucy, you've touched on, but maybe elaborate a little bit more about whether one of the alternative strategies is actually about more education around the social model of disability rights. And Paula is asking this, and this is also something I'm very interested in, because there is that social model, and how much is that front and center of equality law? Now you're muted.
Okay, so my turn. Yes, the perennial joys of Zoom. But isn't it great that we can all be here discussing this at a distance? So I'm not 100% sure what the question is asking, whether there should be more awareness of the social model on the part of legislators and policymakers, or whether it's about taking the ideas of the social model and trying to address the kinds of barriers and prejudice.
Yes, more about that.
Yes, and the structures, I think, perhaps, that, as you said, Nata, ultimately lead to this context where this behavior is acceptable or normalized and not contested. I think absolutely there has to be something more dealt with here. And it goes back to the whole idea of, by the time people turn up in employment and are behaving like this, it's too late. That, you know, you need to get awareness raising, you know, that has to be happening from a very early age, and whether it should be happening in schools, whether there should be you know, awareness campaigns like by the likes of the Human Rights Commission or the IREC or whatever. You know, we need to be identifying those kinds of barriers that impede people's ability to participate and progress in a preemptive sort of way. And those barriers could be attitudinal, but of course they could also be structural. So, you know, again, we need to be thinking about dismantling those barriers that would prevent people from participating in employment or progressing in employment or getting decent work. And I'm trying to keep my answer short here because I'm very aware that our time is practically up at this point. So maybe I should stop talking, and maybe Shreya, if you wanted to add anything. No.
No, and I think that's a very important closing statement, that it is about dismantling. It's not about creating rules that it's more favorable or access, but it's actually fundamentally access in itself is insufficient. It is dismantling. And so I think that's a powerful argument that has come from your critical analysis of case law in Ireland around discrimination and disability, harassment and discrimination.
Thanks, Nata.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Thanks to everyone who has participated, and a special thanks to Shreya for making the time to join us today. You were very insightful, and I look forward to having further interactions with you because we can debate about SDGs. And Lucy, this is an excellent, excellent book, and so happy that we've had this discussion.
Well, thank you so much, Nata and Shreya, both, and to all the participants. I'm so happy that you came today, and hopefully you picked up something of interest in the discussion. And thank you very much.